This week I was due to be speaking to historian David Lee about the relationship between Queen Elizabeth I and the Duke of Anjou. Sadly, we've had to reschedule that for next week, so this week you've just got me. I thought I would share one of my subscriber episodes to give you a sense on what these are all about, and I chose Wyatt's Rebellion. In early 1554, a rebellion against Queen Mary I broke out over fears that her impending marriage to Philip II of Spain would plunge England into becoming nothing more than an extension of Spain. This rebellion has become known as Wyatt's Rebellion. One of its key architects was Thomas Wyatt the Younger, the son of the famed poet Thomas Wyatt Sr., who may have been a one-time love interest of Anne Boleyn. Wyatt's Rebellion would end in failure, but what actually was the rebellion? Who was involved? How serious was the threat against Queen Mary I? And why was its biggest casualty Lady Jane Grey, despite her not being remotely involved? Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 83. What was Wyatt's Rebellion? When Queen Mary I successfully won her crown and went through with a coronation, she became the first undisputed Queen Regnant in English history. The contested reigns of Empress Matilda in the 12th century and Lady Jane Grey, whom Mary overthrew, were not made legitimate, mostly down to the lack of coronation, which is why Mary is seen for many as the genuine first Queen Regnant that we've ever had. Mary was in a deeply challenging position though, for England was, obviously, a very patriarchal society, and whilst the general consensus was that Mary should marry, there was major trepidation about her marrying a foreigner, since that could lead to the interference of a foreign power in English politics. This was not an issue when it was a king. Indeed, Mary's mother was a foreign princess. But when it was the other way around, there were grave concerns, for this was, after all, an age in which the husband was the ruler of the wife. So how would that work in a situation for a queen regnant? Duly, on the 16th of November 1553, a parliamentary delegation went to Queen Mary and formally requested that she choose an English husband, with its obvious although tacit candidate being her kinsman Edward Courtenay, the recently created Earl of Devon, who was the son and heir of Henry Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter, who had been executed as part of the Exeter conspiracy back in 1538. Naturally, other people had other ideas, chief among them being Mary's cousin, the Emperor Charles V, also King of Spain, who saw that an alliance with England would give him supremacy in Europe, and so he sent his minister to England to propose his son as an ideal candidate to marry Mary. Mary was convinced that the safety of England required her to form a closer relationship with Charles's family, the Habsburgs, and so she decided to move forward with marrying Philip. A marriage treaty was presented to the Privy Council on the 7th of December 1553, and even though the terms clearly favoured England and included several safeguards, many still thought that England would be drawn into Philip's wars and become a mere province of the Habsburg Empire. This was of particular concern to the landed gentry and parliamentary classes, who foresaw having to pay greater subsidies to cover the cost of England's participation in foreign wars. Most also knew the stories of the torture and cruelty endured by prisoners of the Spanish Inquisition, and there were even those who had suffered from the rack of the inquisitors themselves. It was not just the English who were alarmed by the pending marriage of Mary and Philip. France, too, feared an alliance between England and Spain. Antoine de Nolay, the French ambassador to England, threatened war and became immediate intrigues with any malcontents he could find. Before Christmas in 1553, anti-Spanish ballads and broadsheets began to circulate through the streets of London. Mary I was, of course, famous for her devotion to the Roman Catholic faith, and many feared that she would restore the Pope as the head of the Church of England and reverse the anti-papal religious policies that had been put in place by her father, Henry VIII, and continued under his successor, Mary's half-brother, Edward VI. A huge swathe of the English people had grown up as Protestant and had major concerns that their religion, although still in its infancy, would be stripped away. Mary had bitterly disapproved of the changes made in the form of worship by her father and regarded the cause of the Pope as her own. Mary's convictions were so strong that when Edward's Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity that required all church services to be in English, she continued to have the traditional Latin Mass celebrated in her private chapel. When this was expressly forbidden, Mary appealed to Charles V, who went to the extreme of threatening England with war if Mary's religion was interfered with. Mary assumed the throne in July 1553, and on the 18th of August she issued a proclamation that was a major step towards re-establishing papal authority, as it strictly forbade Protestant preaching. This not only confirmed the fears of Protestants, it raised the concern of others who were opposed to Rome and did not want to see the Pope at the head of the English Church once again. Those fears of papal restoration were heightened by Mary's pending marriage to Philip, who was considered the most powerful and the most Catholic sovereign in Europe, although his father did not make him King of Spain until 1556. With their fears becoming increasingly realised, some notable Protestants began to conspire against the Queen, developing a plan to oust her from the throne, killing her if necessary, and then installing the Queen's half-sister Elizabeth on the throne in her place. Despite the beliefs of the leaders, the rebellion also acted as a way for the lower classes to voice their frustrations. Specifically, yeomen, husbandmen, and urban workers were able to express social and economic frustrations through the rebellion. Though the unrest was not universal, it was symptomatic of a wide range of discontent among the English population. The key insurgents were, obviously, Sir Thomas Wyatt, and then Sir James Croft, Sir Peter Carew, and Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk. So who were these men? Sir Thomas Wyatt was a courtier and the son of another Thomas Wyatt, the famed poet who was a popular figure at the court of King Henry VIII. Wyatt Sr. would famously have close association with Anne Boleyn, for it's possible that the pair had a short-lived romantic relationship prior to Anne Boleyn catching Henry VIII's eye. Thomas Wyatt Jr. was popular at the court of Edward VI and owned large areas of land in Kent and held great influence over that county. Although Thomas Wyatt initially seemed to have supported Mary and did declare her to be the Queen against the coup which placed Lady Jane Grey on the throne, he was against the planned marriage to Philip, stating that it would lead to the most miserable servitude and establish popish religion. However, Wyatt cautioned against using religion as the reason for the rebellion, for that will withdraw from us the hearts of many. You must only make your quarrel for overrunning by strangers. As an apparent aside, he did go on to say, in council, as unto my friend, that the sole goal was the return of Protestantism. Wyatt has been described as hot-headed, with a reputation for being wild and impetuous, and once spent a month in the Tower of London for participating in a street riot in London. At one point, he and his neighbours in Kent had put together a plan for a local militia, and that gave Wyatt a way to quickly mobilise armed forces. Wyatt, like many, depended on the Privy Council for offices and income, and under Mary, by not being a Roman Catholic, that put his position in jeopardy and could have been one of the main reasons why he chose to rebel. James Croft, another of the key figures, came from an influential Hertfordshire family. Unlike Wyatt, Croft appears not to have made the same kind of strong statements regarding Mary's marriage to Philip, so his motivation for participating in the rebellion is less clear. He was not particularly strong in his religious beliefs, but probably favoured Protestantism, as he did not have any problem supporting Protestant efforts when they were part of his duties while Lord Deputy of Ireland in 1551 and 1552. Croft's military career and service are likely to have informed his decision to participate in the rebellion, and he would have had the same concerns as Wyatt with respect to his future financial well-being. This concern would have been even greater for Croft since he was clearly out of favour with Mary well before the rebellion. Sir Peter Carew was an MP for Devon. He was also a maritime adventurer and, according to his contemporary biographer, was an earnest promoter of God's true religion and constant in advancing the Protestant cause. The Spanish ambassador reported to Philip that Carew was the greatest heretic and rebel in England, and noted how in Parliament he supported Courtenay as Mary's potential husband, for the Courtenays were a Devon family, and opposed the restoration of the Catholic religion in England. Like Wyatt and Croft, Carew also feared a Spanish marriage would endanger his career. The final key figure was Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, a great-grandson of Elizabeth Woodville and the father of Lady Jane Grey. His marriage to Frances Brandon, a granddaughter of Henry VII, made Henry an extended member of the royal family, and his 3 daughters, Jane, Catherine and Mary, were senior in the line of succession to the throne. Although not an active participant in creating the rebellion, Edward Courtenay was inadvertently involved as well, for as the great-grandson of Edward IV, he was of royal blood and was the preference for many who wanted Mary to marry an Englishman. Around the 26th of November 1553, the 4 leaders of the plot, Wyatt, Croft, Carew and the Duke of Suffolk, began to iron out their plans. The first idea was for there to be an uprising in Devon, where Philip was expected to land, and where Carew and Courtenay had resources to call upon. By Christmas of 1553, however, it was decided that each of the 4 leaders would raise rebellion forces in their respective counties, and together they would converge on London on the 18th of March 1554, which was shortly before Philip was expected to leave from Spain. They would then replace Mary with her half-sister Elizabeth, who would then marry Courtenay. Meanwhile, a fleet of French ships would prevent Philip of Spain from reaching England. To be successful, the rebellion needed many participants, and rumours quickly spread with varying degrees of accuracy. As early as the 29th of December 1553, Simon Reynard, Spain's ambassador to England, informed Mary of the suspected plot, in which certain persons are trying to persuade Courtenay to seize the Tower of London. Some of the rumours would have come from Devon, where Carew was making little effort to hide his efforts to raise support for the rebellion. He was able to gain enough support to take over Exeter Castle, but Carew lacked sufficient influence in Devon to fulfil his part in the rebellion, at least in part due to his own role in suppressing the Prayer Book rebellion in 1549. Carew's activities attracted the attention of the Privy Council, and on the 7th of January 1554 it sent a letter of appearance to him with the intention of either confining Carew in the Tower of London if he appeared, or causing him to ultimately show his hand by not appearing. Carew did not appear, leading the council to send a letter to the Sheriff of Devon to bring Carew to the council. The sheriff told Carew about the letter and gave him time to sell his farm and flee to France on the 25th of January 1554. Carew was readily received in France and was given the task of ensuring further support from the French as part of the rebellion. The French supplied him with arms, ships and money, and they plundered the Flemish and Spanish ships, swearing that they would not let Philip set foot on English soil. Mary was alarmed by the number of desertions and their potential threat, and demanded that King Henry II of France capture them and hand them over to her, which he refused to do. However, as time went on, the insurgents in France found their leisure very heavy on their hands, and their purses very light in their pockets, and they began to return slowly back to England. Carew, however, stayed in France until the summer of 1554, when he went over to Italy. Shortly before Carew fled, Courtenay was arrested and admitted to having been approached by the individuals concerning several things touching religion and the intended marriage. His revelations on the 21st of January were followed by the arrests of 2 or 3 men who had committed to the cause, and it became clear that the rebellion could not wait until the 18th of March. The very next day, Wyatt called a meeting of his key supporters, and the decision was made to start the rebellion in 3 days' time. The 25th of January was set as the start of the rebellion, which was around the time a messenger from Mary arrived with a summons for Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, to come to court. He hid his true intentions by saying, "I was coming to her grace, ye may see I am booted and spurred, ready to ride." He gave the messenger who brought the letter a reward and drink, and then he fled, sensing that it was a trap. The Duke gathered up as much money as he could and rode without stopping to Lutterworth, where others joined him. On the morning of the 29th of January, Suffolk read Wyatt's proclamation in Leicester, and on the next day he led his troops towards Coventry, where there were others who believed in the rebellion and were expected to open the gates for him. However, with the rebellion having now been exposed, the gates were closed and the walls stoutly defended. The Duke of Suffolk grew ill, and learning that he was a wanted man, he took refuge with his brother, Lord John Grey. They hid in the cottage of one of Lord Grey's gamekeepers, intending to lie low until they could escape abroad. However, deciding that the cottage was no longer safe, Suffolk hid in the hollow of a nearby old decaying tree. He stayed there for 2 days and a night in the cold of winter and without any food. Either because of the reward or fear of retribution for aiding Suffolk, the gamekeeper betrayed Suffolk's hiding place. When troops arrived, they found Suffolk warming himself by a fire, unable to endure the cold any longer. His brother was found buried under some bundles of hay shortly afterwards. The two were arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Suffolk's involvement would have utterly catastrophic implications for his eldest daughter Jane. Lady Jane Grey was famously proclaimed Queen following the death of Edward VI and reigned for a total of 13 days, although this is often and erroneously reduced down to 9. When Jane's rule was toppled by Mary, she became a prisoner in the Tower of London and would eventually go to trial, in which she was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Mary, however, refused to proceed with the execution, believing quite rightly that Jane was a mere pawn, her royal blood being used by ambitious men, most notably John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Moreover, Jane Grey was just 16 years old, and a cousin of the Queen to boot. Jane Grey was thus in the Tower of London as a prisoner, but would have likely, in time, been released. That all changed when Henry Grey became so involved in Wyatt's rebellion. Feeling that her hand was now forced, Mary agreed to proceed with Jane's execution, which took place on the 12th of February 1554. James Croft was somewhat more successful than the Duke of Suffolk, leaving London to raise forces in Wales. Several trained local forces and their leaders joined with Croft, but that caught the attention of the council, which sent orders to the Lord President of the Council of the Marches to stop the rebels. Unable to defeat the troops from the council, Croft and his forces set up camp on the bank of the stream to wait for reinforcements that were supposed to be coming from Wales. However, the council troops surrounded the camp, preventing the insurgents from getting food. Croft's forces tried to force their way out, but most were either killed or taken prisoner. Without the ability to continue the fight, Croft surrendered and was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Wyatt started the uprising on the 25th of January 1554 by raising his standard at Maidstone, and with the ringing of church bells and the reading of a proclamation there and elsewhere saying that Mary's marriage to Philip would bring upon this realm most miserable servitude and establish popish religion. Setting up his headquarters at Rochester, Wyatt had gained a force of about 2,000 by the 27th of January, with men coming from other towns. On the 28th of January, a rebel force of about 500 was heading to Rochester to join with Wyatt when they were met by a force of about 600 supporters of Mary, led by Henry Neville, Lord Bergavenny, and Sir Robert Southwell, the High Sheriff of Kent. The rebel forces were routed, leaving behind 60 prisoners. About the same time, a force of 500 whitecoats, so called because their uniforms were all white, were sent from London under the command of the elderly Duke of Norfolk. Yup, that guy, Thomas Howard, the dickwad uncle of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, is still kicking around at this point. But instead of attacking the insurgents, as they were supposed to do, the whitecoats came down the hill to Rochester shouting, "We are all Englishmen," deserting to the rebels. Wyatt had been able to seize some of Mary's ships waiting to escort Philip, as well as some cannon, and with the addition of the whitecoats, his forces had grown to about 3,000. The whitecoats urged him to move quickly to London, saying London longed sore for their coming. 3 days later, the insurgents were on the road to the capital when they were met by delegates sent by Mary with instructions to discuss Wyatt's grievances. The delegates told Wyatt that Mary wanted to understand the cause of the rebellion, which would make him a traitor, since in his proclamations he had called himself true to the crown. On the surface, this would have seemed to have been an attempt at opening negotiations, but the real purposes were to gain time for Mary to increase the strength of her forces and to hear Wyatt state the reasons for the rebellion to help her plan a course of action. If Wyatt refused to negotiate, Mary would be able to say that Wyatt was aiming at the crown and intended to overthrow religion, shed blood, sack London, ruin the kingdom, and bring in the French. Wyatt answered the delegates saying that he was no traitor and the purpose of the rebellion was to defend against overrun by strangers, which would surely occur if the marriage took place. The delegates then extended Mary's offer for Wyatt to come to her and be heard, to which Wyatt agreed, saying, "I will rather be trusted than trust," before adding the requirements that he be given control of the Tower of London with Mary inside it and sole discretion for replacing certain members of the council. Wyatt's answer reached Mary the next day, the 1st of February. Noailles, the French ambassador, noted that if Wyatt had been able to reach London at the same time as his answer did, that the gates would have been open, and the whole population would have been eager to give him welcome. Instead, Wyatt's delay gave Mary time to use his words against him, which he did in a speech later that day at the Guildhall, which was full due to it being Candlemas. Mary delivered a rousing speech, telling of her desire to quell the rebellion by mercy instead of justice of the sword. She shared Wyatt's insolent and proud answers and addressed the issue of her marriage to Philip, saying that she was already married to the people of England and that nothing was more acceptable to my heart nor more unanswerable to my will than your advancement in wealth and welfare. Mary's speech was tremendously successful, as the next day there were some 25,000 ready to protect her and London from Wyatt and his forces, which had grown to an alarming 15,000 men. Mary issued a proclamation declaring Wyatt a traitor and offered a reward of £100 for his capture, dead or alive. Wyatt arrived at Southwark on the 2nd of February, intending to cross the River Thames and enter London by way of London Bridge. However, the gates were closed and the drawbridge flung down into the water. The residents of Southwark saw the guns of the Tower of London aimed directly at them and begged Thomas Wyatt to leave. On the 6th of February, he headed to Kingston upon Thames, marching at night with the goal of surprising Mary at daybreak. The bridge in Kingston, the next one upstream at this time, was broken, but Wyatt's men repaired it, crossed over and continued on for the capital. Wyatt lost time repairing a cannon that had broken down, which he refused to leave behind. He also lost the element of surprise, and many of his men lost hope of success and deserted him. Wyatt continued on, and he and his remaining rebels encountered artillery fire and attacks from horse brigades. When the remaining force arrived at Ludgate, they found it defended. Wyatt turned and headed back towards Westminster, only to be met by other forces loyal to Mary, and a brief skirmish ensued. Wyatt met with a herald who urged him to earn the Queen's pardon by avoiding further bloodshed. Wyatt surrendered, and he and his chief supporters were taken to the Tower of London. Although Elizabeth was not an active participant in the rebellion, Mary did not know that and acted on the assumption that her half-sister was. Mary had Elizabeth watched continuously, but became concerned that Elizabeth might go into hiding before there was enough evidence to arrest her. Under the guise of keeping her from harm, Mary sent a letter to Elizabeth on the 26th of January 1554 for her to come and stay with Mary for her own protection. The intent, however, was to arrest Elizabeth as soon as she arrived. Perhaps sensing the trap, Elizabeth declined, saying that she was too ill to travel. The end of the rebellion might be said to have begun on the 5th of February 1554, with the deciphering of an intercepted letter from Noailles to the King of France. It identified the purpose of the rebellion as the dethroning of Mary in favour of Elizabeth. There was nothing in it to indicate any complicity on the part of the Queen's half-sister, but it did include Courtenay's role, which had not been included in his confession at his earlier arrest, which put the blame on everyone else but himself. 2 days later, a proclamation was issued that forbid the sheltering of any of the insurgents under pain of death. Hundreds of fugitives were given up, so many that the prisons of London could not hold them all, and churches were therefore used to house prisoners while they waited for what they assumed would be their deaths by hanging, the punishment for common treason. A general execution of the common prisoners began on the 12th of February 1554, with gallows erected all over London. For weeks, prisoners were tried on a daily basis, with hanging, often with the body then beheaded, quartered or both, and displayed on spikes at London Bridge. However, the number of people executed relative to the numbers arrested was actually quite low. Just 150 died out of over 3,000 who'd been captured. The small number of executions, together with the lack of incriminating evidence against Elizabeth, led Reynard to conclude that Mary was being too lenient with the rebels, making it unsafe for Philip to be in England. The Emperor Charles V also believed that the alliance between England and Spain would fail if Elizabeth remained alive. However, Elizabeth was powerful, had many friends, and was widely popular with the English people, and so Reynard did not believe that action could be taken against her without conclusive proof of her complicity in the rebellion. In an attempt to get incriminating evidence against Elizabeth, those suspecting of having information on Elizabeth's role were held without knowing what might happen to them so that they could incriminate her in the hope of being pardoned. During this time, it's also possible that torture was used in attempts to get the desired evidence against Elizabeth. Those examining the leaders were also reported as having used trick questions to get the answers they wanted, whether accurate or otherwise. As a leader of the rebellion, Wyatt's trial was delayed from his 7th of February 1554 surrender until the 15th of March. Despite being travailed with during this time, he did provide some information, but it was limited and somewhat infrequent. He named Sir William St. Lo, Elizabeth's servant, as the one who had initiated the rebellion, an indirect implication of Elizabeth's involvement. He also said that Croft knew more about it. When Wyatt was finally brought to trial, he pleaded guilty to treason, asserting that he never intended any harm to Mary and only wanted to prevent the coming in of strangers and Spaniards. He offered to provide great discoveries if his life was spared, claiming that Courtenay was the originator of the rebellion and that it was planned for Courtenay's benefit. Wyatt also accused Elizabeth of having been involved in the conspiracy. Whatever conclusions the court drew from Wyatt's testimony, it was not enough to keep him from being sentenced to death by hanging, with his body to be drawn and quartered. However, it was some time before the sentence would be carried out, in the hope that more could still be learned from him. Wyatt's sentence was finally carried out on the 11th of April 1554, without his having provided anything of significance to incriminate Elizabeth. Before he was hanged, however, he avowed that neither Elizabeth nor Courtenay were involved in the rebellion. He admitted that he had testified differently at his trial. As I covered earlier, because of the Duke of Suffolk's participation in the rebellion, his daughter, Lady Jane Grey, and her husband, Guildford Dudley, were beheaded on the 12th of February, 5 days before Suffolk's own trial on the 17th of February 1554. The Duke was haughty in defending himself, immediately challenging the judge by asking if it was treason for a peer like himself to make a proclamation and raise support to keep strangers out of the realm. But the judge did not answer the question. When the issue of his resistance to the forces sent against him was raised, Suffolk again made an arrogant reply which gave the court what it needed to convict him. He was sent back to the Tower of London and beheaded 6 days later. With the rebellion over, Charles V sent word to Mary in March that he was relying upon her to protect his son, Philip, whilst he was in England. He specifically wanted immediate and summary judgment for both Courtenay and Elizabeth, pointing out that Mary now had the opportunity to fulfil her duty to the church and should not neglect that. But Elizabeth had wide popularity and very powerful friends, such as the Lord Admiral of England, leading Charles to conclude that proof of Elizabeth's complicity was needed before any judgment could be imposed. Mary again summoned Elizabeth to come to London, but assuming that Elizabeth's previous claims of illness was actually a ploy, she sent 2 of her own physicians and 3 of her privy councillors to speak with Elizabeth directly. The physicians determined that the illness was real, but not severe enough to prevent Elizabeth from travelling to London. They had brought Mary's litter for Elizabeth and made the trip in stages of not more than 8 miles a day. Elizabeth arrived in London on the 23rd of February with the curtains of her litter opened. She was pale and dressed in white, and was said to have displayed a proud, haughty expression, although this was likely propaganda from Mary's supporters. Mary refused to see Elizabeth and put her in a secluded part of her palace where no one could pass without encountering a guard. The council was divided with respect to Elizabeth, with many members supportive of her. This led to bitter arguments and disagreement as to her fate. On the 16th of March, Elizabeth was examined again, and this time those on the council that were against her claimed the evidence sufficient enough to send Elizabeth to the Tower. While Elizabeth's friends on the council argued against it, they acquiesced when the question was raised as to who would be responsible for her if she were not in the Tower, since whoever took on such a responsibility would be in great danger and the subject of much suspicion. Elizabeth was not moved immediately, however. Fearing the Tower would end up meaning her death, Elizabeth made one last appeal to Mary, which was in writing since Mary would still not see her. In it, Elizabeth swore her innocence and her loyalty to Mary. Mary did not answer, and on the 18th of March, Palm Sunday, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower. She would remain there for 2 months, but was released on the 19th of May 1554, the anniversary of her mother's execution, something which cannot have been a coincidence. She was released for lack of any solid evidence. Despite the limited immediate impact of Wyatt's rebellion, it did have some long-lasting effects. Many, including some of his adversaries, were sympathetic to Wyatt's daring and gallantry. At the time of Wyatt's execution, people crowded around to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood. Many began to view Wyatt as a martyr, and those who disliked Mary's marriage to Philip regarded Wyatt and his followers as good English patriots and not heretics. Christopher Goodman, a 16th century clergyman, wrote the following: "If it is treason to defend the gospel from his country from cruel strangers and enemies, then was Wyatt a traitor and rebel? But if this was his duty, and all others that professed Christ amongst you, then are all such traitors as did deceive him, and such as took not his part also, when time and occasion by him was justly offered." What I think is so fascinating about Wyatt's rebellion is that it very nearly had the capacity to work. Huge numbers of people got behind Wyatt and the other rebel leaders, and were it not for Queen Mary's incredible speech to the people of London, I think it's fair to say that she'd have been in genuine danger of being overthrown. Once the tide turned resolutely in Mary's favour, the irony was that it then created the most dangerous position that Princess Elizabeth had ever been in. She was the figure the rebels wanted to install as queen, but by making her that figure, it put a huge price on her head. Now, whether Mary would have actually ever gone ahead with executing her sister is one of the great what-ifs in history, but her willingness to destroy those of royal blood is proven when she agreed to execute Jane Grey, and so I think we can safely say that Elizabeth was in an extremely precarious position. Wyatt's rebellion was a failure, and as I've covered, was ultimately what ensured Lady Jane Grey's own death. Its biggest achievement was for Mary to solidify her place as rightful queen. She may have not donned armour and ridden into battle, but she stoutly defended her kingdom and crown, delivering a speech that, though far less famous than her sister's speech at Tilbury 34 years later, helped save the day, reminding the people of England that she was their mother and that the likes of Wyatt had no place in society. And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. As I said at the start, this is one of my subscriber episodes. I release those weekly, and they are always me, basically, talking about a different subject from Tudor history, Plantagenet history, and they range from things about people to palaces to periods of time to events. To access these, just head over to patreon.com/the Tudor Chest or sign up via Apple Podcasts. Next week, I am going to be bringing back a guest, and it is David Lee, as I said at the start. He's going to be coming on to discuss the relationship, as I said, between Queen Elizabeth I and the Duke of Anjou, the man that she became potentially the closest to marrying. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.